Welcome to this latest edition in our video interview series here at iConnect. My name is Richard Albert, and today I'm joined by Alkmene Fotiadou, a research associate at the Center for European Constitutional Law in Greece. Hi.
Hi, Richard. How are you? It's nice to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you, Alkmene. And let me tell our viewers why you're joining us today. I read one of your recent blog posts on constitutional change, which is a blog that's associated with the CECL. And the blog post that you wrote was entitled, "Greece Faces the Possibility of an Unconstitutional Constitutional Revision." I found the piece fascinating, provocative, and just interesting. And so I said, hey, let's invite Alkmene to join us to talk about what's going on in Greece. And I want to thank you, Alkmene Fotiadou, from Greece, for joining us today to talk about what's happening in Greece with regard to constitutional amendment, constitutional revision, constitutional change. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for the interest in this. Recently, we had major developments in Greece, a development that we've been waiting for quite a while, because the Prime Minister of Greece announced in a rather ceremonial speech that he would initiate constitutional revision and his proposals for this revision. Allow me to say that this has been a long-awaited revision, because in the Greek constitution we have a mandatory time lapse in between revisions. So ever since the financial crisis broke out, there was no formal change to the constitution. And even after this mandatory time lapse was over, nobody dared, at the moment, there were other problems, so nobody started a constitutional revision. So at this point, we have the proposal to actually begin a constitutional revision. The characteristics, however, the basic features of the proposal seem to suggest that there is a very high possibility of an unconstitutional constitutional revision taking place, both violating the procedural limits of the Constitution, the procedural limits of our amending formula, and the material limits of the amendment formula. And so there might be a problem perhaps with that. So the next question is whether this will be some sort of democratic revolution. I think you could recognize one if you saw it. Or it will be just a violation of the amendment formula. So this is where we stand, and we now have the proposals for this revision.
Okay, so let's begin with you explaining to us the ordinary rules of constitutional amendment under the Greek constitution.
Okay, the ordinary way to revise the constitution is follow the amendment formula of the Greek constitution, which sets very strict procedural limits and also quite a few material limits. The process is that it is initiated by 50 MPs in parliament, and then 2 consecutive votes take place. Then there has to be a general election, and this is supposed to be the way that the people, the citizenry, participate in the revision process. And then the next parliament, which we call the revision parliament, will actually revise the constitution. Now, in the first parliament, we have 2 votes that have to be the 3/5 of parliamentarians, but there is a reversed vote. So if it doesn't get that, and it does get the majority of the parliament +1, then it's the 3/5 in the next parliament. And this is the process. And that's it. So, and the material limits, among others, entrench the form of government. So the form of government in Greece, we have democracy, which is with parliamentary democracy. So I think that anything that would endanger that would fall within the scope of a violation of the amendment formula and its material limits. And also it's the representative character of our democracy, which is also entrenched in the amendment formula.
Okay, so these are the rules of the rules of ordinary constitutional amendment in Greece. It seems to be a process dominated by legislative actors. There is some indirect popular participation there through the electoral process. Thank you.
Yes.
Now, the latest revision effort, the one that you wrote about in your blog post for constitutional change, suggests that a different process of amendment will be deployed to make this change to the Constitution of Greece.
Yes, of course, the Prime Minister stated that they intend to stay within the spirit of the amendment formula and that they will not violate it. Now, remaining within the spirit is rather abstract as a statement. And they said that this process will take place through a novel deliberation in all municipalities of Greece, and that it will probably involve a referendum, which is just a possibility. He did not say that we will go through with a referendum, but he said that it will probably lead to a referendum. And also there will be some sort of attempt to use social media. They talked about in very abstract terms that there will be a web page. So it will be, he said, by the citizens, for the citizens, a democratic revolution. And so this is not something which is really within the scope of the amendment formula. And it's very difficult to keep it because there are many questions. Okay, what municipalities? How will they organize that? Will there be guarantees? Is there going to be a random selection of citizens to seek for the ordinary citizen? Is it going to be anyone who wants to go? And how binding would that be? And of course, a referendum is completely out of the, we have referendums in the Greek constitution. We had the referendum last year, but not as part of the amendment formula. And the only kind of referendum that could be used is a referendum that involves, it is initiated by the government, so it's different actors here, and then it's passed by a majority of parliamentarians, and then it goes. So it's completely unthinkable to see how this will connect to the amendment formula without somehow rigging it.
So how will the referendum, if it does take place, how will that fit into the current process of constitutional amendment in the Greek constitution? Is the idea that the referendum will come before the dissolution of the first parliament, after the reformation of the parliament following the elections? What are people saying about when the referendum would take place, if in fact it is held?
Well, apparently they said it will take place before the elections. So the trick here is that the first parliament decides on the provisions that are to be revised and gives instructions as to their content. But there is no possible way to legally bind the next parliament with regard to the content of the provisions. So actually, the next parliament gets to decide on the content. So what happens, and I'm asking, I mean, that's the questions that arise because there hasn't been anything definite. How will this fit in? That is, if you put something on referendum, 1 or 2 or 3 proposals, and which proposals? How will this be binding to the next parliament? And how will this interfere? Of course, it is true that the intervening elections usually do not have much to do with a revision. There are hot issues, there are political issues, polarization, so that people usually do not vote on specific revision questions. Nonetheless, if you have a referendum, what will the next parliament do? How will this fit in? It's very odd. And also the possibility of a referendum, not even we don't know when it will take place and even if it will take place. Now, revision has to do with multiple actors, constitutional actors, political actors. Now, so there's a lot of negotiation. How can you negotiate when you know that the other party will probably change the rules in the middle of the game? I don't know how this could work. And that's why I wrote this spontaneous response, which was my first take on the proposals of the Prime Minister.
And so tell us, why is it a problem for you that, and maybe for the Constitution of Greece, why is it a problem that a referendum could be used as part of the larger process to revise the Constitution?
Strictly speaking, because it's clearly not part of the formal amendment rules, and since the restoration of democracy in Greece in 1975, revisions have followed the rules, and this I think is important. Secondly, because I don't think a constituting and continuing legitimacy, as you would say, in this effort, right? Because there is polarization. The numbers do not suggest that the people, a vast majority of the people, would want something which is not allowed by doing it through the proper way. Actually, they're not even suggesting to change the amendment formula as part of the proposal. So if they wanted to insert referenda in the amendment formula, this would be a different discussion with different questions emerging. But to just do it without it being in the amendment formula, it suggests problems also in conjunction with the fact that if you read their proposals one by one, you can discuss them, but the combination of the proposals could lead to a change in the form of government. So
and this would be a violation of one of the material limits.
Exactly. So you have process and you have the material limits, and you don't have really this kind of popular support to that. And also there is some sort of narrative in the speech that whoever does not want a referendum would be either conservative or afraid of democracy. Nonetheless, there are other things that one can be afraid of referendums as a constitutional scholar, or even when looking at the referendum as a process. I mean, last year's referendum in Greece was not a model referendum. It was a very problematic referendum, to put it mildly. So I would also be very hesitant to accept as a democratic expression of the people on constitutional issues a referendum organized after the only example we had in Greece for the last 40 years, which was the Brexit referendum, which probably you've also heard about.
So why is a referendum even suggested at this stage to revise the Constitution? We know, of course, about the referendum from last year, but that was not to amend the Constitution. This is an effort to amend the Constitution, to revise the Constitution, as the Constitution itself says. It doesn't use the word amend, it uses the word revise.
We use the word revise, yes.
Yeah, so why is a referendum even being suggested as part of the amendment, the revision process, rather?
I can't really answer because it was not really my idea. Of course, we know that in countries that were struck by the crisis, some attempts of crowdsourcing the constitution or using assemblies to revise the constitution were used. So possibly they connote this kind of popular involvement. Otherwise, another explanation would be that also within the suggestions of the forthcoming amendment is the use of referenda, a very augmented use of referendums, and as it is right now, also very questionable in the sense that you introduce popular initiative, and also you which has very 500, I think, signatures to just change something of crucial national importance, as it is called. And then with 1 million signatures, you may change either legislation which is already passed, ask to abolish it, or introduce new laws without any suggested limits to that. So from no referendums, we go to a very participatory democracy, but I don't really know, because last year referendums, I repeat, had no characteristics of a democratic referendum. It lacked many of the guarantees.
Could your argument be critiqued as making a case against more democracy? So the idea of a referendum, of course, is to, at its best, at its strongest, the idea of a referendum is to involve people in making decisions that are important to the state, to the Constitution. You're suggesting that the referendum here that is being proposed as a possibility to revise the Constitution is problematic because it doesn't conform to the formal rules of constitutional revision that are in the Greek Constitution. But this is an effort to involve people in the process. Why is that a bad thing?
I think, first of all, involving the people in the process is not a bad thing. And I could see ways to seek more deliberation in the forthcoming amendment that would involve the people and would not mess with the formal amendment proposal. Secondly, if there was a proposal to amend the amendment formula, relax it, because the first thing that does not bring the Constitution close to the people is a very stringent amendment formula. Actually, Xenophon Kondiadis, Professor Xenophon Kondiadis, in a book that he wrote about 10 years ago, had suggested that we introduce in the amendment formula a referendum. Of course, there you have to be careful because other problems may emerge, and that what might begin with the purpose to involve the people may sort of make the formula more perplexed and the Constitution more rigid, so it may stay untouched for even more years. But this is a matter of constitutional design. So it is not a matter of not wanting the people involved in the amendment process. I would go for it, and I would discuss any suggestion to have constitutional referendums as part of the formula. But to just say that we might use a referendum with regard to the process when it's clearly not in the amendment formula, in the midst of a financial crisis with polarization between political parties and no political homogeneity and the citizenry just wanting change, then it could be a populist approach to constitutional amendment, and also to say that anyone who does not want referendums is afraid of the will of the people. I think it's an oversimplification, because you have to see even the question of last year's referendum that we had to answer, that was so ambiguous that you could interpret it in at least 3 or 4 different ways before the referendum and after the referendum. So that's
it's not an argument against democracy, as it were. It's an argument for democracy, but done in the right way.
Yes, I think so. And I think that at this point, to abide by the rules of the game, I think it would be quite important for a revision of the Constitution that will really work. For better or worse, our amendment rules require some sort of heightened consensus between the political parties. And so I think this is a good starting point. It has led to rigidity, indeed. But nonetheless, abiding by the rules, I think, is important. I don't see a democratic revolution. So if there is not a democratic revolution, then there's something wrong with using these methods.
Let me ask you to look outside of Greece, So you mentioned earlier the crowdsourcing of constitutions. I assume you were referring, for example, to Iceland. One of the places where we've seen participatory processes in constitutional revision recently. We've also seen it in Ireland. Are there similarities, in your view, between what is being proposed in Greece with what we've seen in Ireland, in Iceland, perhaps elsewhere around the world?
I think it's the mixture. I think it's a mixture, and I think the idea has to do with Iceland and Ireland. But the thing is that, first of all, to really employ such procedures, you have to look at Iceland and see what went wrong there. Because I think that the narrative is that the constitution was crowdsourced, but you have to look also what was not working, because it did not work out. And also in Ireland, there is a difference. People are very familiar with referendums. And even there, although the process is a good process, and I'm not sure that we're going to follow it, because it's one thing to say that we'll have deliberation in municipalities, and a different thing to say that we will very carefully select random citizens and create mini publics. It's a wholly different thing. And I think that even in Ireland, there are criticisms against this procedure, which went fine, but it did not produce the result that many hoped for. So before entering this kind of design, you have to be very careful to know from these procedures. I think that. And of course, it makes sense that Iceland and Ireland were also struck by the financial crisis to a great degree, and Greece also falls within that definition, I think, of this group of countries.
Alkmene, where are the courts in all of this?
Well,
in Greece,
the courts, yes, of course. To talk about a unconstitutional constitutional amendment, you have to have someone who can actually rule on that. We have not had any courts. We have a diffuse system of control of the constitutionality of laws, and we have a high special court that resolves differences in cases of unconstitutionality between high courts. Now, the trick is that we have just one decision when this court said that it has the capacity to decide on constitutional amendments. It has not been used, but it's there. Okay, the court there is a ruling which says that I have the power to do it. So if it happens, we might have some sort of judicial review of the constitutional amendment, but it's not sure. We have no practice of that. Just this line in a judgment.
And do we know from this single decision who might have standing to challenge a revision as being unconstitutional?
No, not really, no. But I think that anyone could claim that in this court. I think that there will be a process going through the other courts, and they will judge on the constitutionality.
Okay. Let's stay with a comparative perspective on this question for my last question to you, and thank you again for your time. Are we witnessing a trend toward the use of more participatory procedures in the revision or amendment of constitutions? And if so, would you say that the Greek effort here to revise the constitution reflects this trend and is part of this trend?
I think it's part of a trend. Actually, we worked on a book called Participatory Constitutional Change, The People as Amenders of the Constitution, which is bound to be out in October at Routledge Publishers. And it focuses exactly on this phenomenon, the trend to involve the people through constitutional referendum and other participatory procedures in constitutional amendment. And we have of course, the examples of Iceland and Ireland, but also many theoretical parts. And we're really trying to explore why this happens. Are we witnessing now a rise of democracy after many years where rights and liberty discussions prevailed? Is it in Europe? It could be a reaction toward the loss of sovereignty, where you turn towards your own constitution and you say, I want to participate in that. Is it the crisis? Is it shortcomings of parliamentary democracy? You have to ask why. And then you have to ask an even more difficult question, which is how can this be achieved within the formal amendment rules? How much important it is to have a referendum culture? So is your goal to really give the people who are already familiar with referendums a say through such procedures in constitutional amendment? Or is it to create an amendment, a culture for referendums in amendment from scratch, which is really different? And also how to design these formulas without adding an extra hurdle in the formula. So this may backfire, and with what is designed to give people a stronger say in their constitution, end up in distancing the people in practice and channeling change through other informal ways of constitutional change. So there is much to talk about, and I think that it is certainly a trend and certainly something that we have to discuss very seriously. I mean, we had Greece, we had the Brexit referendum recently, which will bring immense informal constitutional change when and if it happens. And so I think it's a distinct trend.
Well, we just have to read your forthcoming book to learn more.
Yes, you certainly have, and I hope you enjoy it.
Congratulations, by the way. So, Alkmene, before we go, what are you working on these days?
Actually, we're currently working on this book, the finalizing certain things, because it's going to be out in October, and we're trying to start a new comparative project also, but I won't talk too much about it. I think that what it is important now is to focus on how we can see the people as amenders of the Constitution, and I'm actually now writing a new follow-up on that.
Oh, this sounds fascinating. Well, Alkmene Fotiadou, Research Associate at the Center for European Constitutional Law in Greece, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the recent revision proposal in Greece, which you suggest might actually be an unconstitutional constitutional revision. We'll have to wait and see what you write next on your blog.
Well, yes, thank you, Richard, and there may be other developments too.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.